You were the easy one, the one who never caused problems, the one teachers praised and relatives held up as an example, the one who learned early that keeping the peace was more important than speaking your mind. You didn't throw tantrums in grocery stores. You didn't slam doors or scream that you hated everyone. You read the room before you entered it. You made yourself small when things got tense. You figured out what people needed from you, and you became that. And everyone said you were so mature for your age. But here's what no one tells you about being the good kid. It works. It works brilliantly, in fact, for a very long time. It gets you through childhood. It gets you through school. It might even carry you well into your 20s or 30s. And then, one day, something breaks. Maybe it's a relationship that falls apart because you can never say what you actually need. Maybe it's a career that looks impressive from the outside, but leaves you feeling hollow every single day. Maybe it's an anxiety that won't let you rest, a depression that doesn't make sense given how well your life looks on paper, or a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seems to touch. You've done everything right. You've followed all the rules. You've been good your entire life. So why does it feel like you're falling apart? The answer is not that something is wrong with you. The answer is that something is finally right. The collapse you're experiencing, the exhaustion, the confusion, the sense that the old ways aren't working anymore. This isn't failure. This is awakening. This is the true self, buried for so long, finally demanding to be heard. And it will be heard, whether you're ready or not, because you were never meant to live this way forever. The good child was always a temporary solution to a childhood problem. And childhood is over now. The problem has changed, and so must the solution. The answer lies in understanding something that might sound strange at first. The strategies that saved you as a child are now destroying you as an adult. The very qualities that made you the good kid, the responsible one, the peacemaker, aren't signs of healthy development. They're survival adaptations. And like all survival adaptations, they come with a cost that eventually comes due. To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning, not just to your childhood, but to the fundamental psychological needs every child brings into the world. Every child is born with certain non-negotiable requirements for healthy development. British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott spent decades studying these needs, and his work revealed something crucial. Children don't just need food, shelter, and physical safety. They need what Winnicott called a holding environment, a psychological space where they can be themselves without consequence. In the earlier stages of life, a child's primary caregiver needs to be what Winnicott termed good enough. Not perfect, good enough. This means being emotionally present, reasonably attuned to the child's needs, and responsive in a way that makes the child feel that their inner world matters. The child cries, the parent responds. The child has needs, the parent notices. The child has feelings, and those feelings are acknowledged as real and valid. When this happens consistently, the child develops what Winnicott called a true self, an authentic core identity based on spontaneous feelings, genuine desires, and the lived experience of being valued for who they actually are. But when the environment isn't good enough, something else happens. When a parent is overwhelmed, depressed, anxious, narcissistic, emotionally unavailable, or simply too burdened by their own struggles to attune to their child. The child must adapt, and children are remarkably good at adapting. The child learns to read the parent's mood before expressing their own needs. They learn to gauge whether it's safe to be hungry, tired, sad, or angry. They learn to prioritize the parent's emotional state over their own. Because in the economy of childhood, the parent's stability is survival itself. This adaptation creates what Winnicott called a false self, a constructed persona designed to manage the environment rather than express the person. The false self isn't fake in the sense of being deliberately deceptive. It's a genuine survival strategy built by a child who needed to become something other than who they naturally were in order to stay safe and connected. And here's the tragic irony. The children who are best at building this false self, the ones who are most sensitive, most perceptive, most gifted at reading others, are often the ones who suffer the most. Their very gifts become the tools of their own suppression. This is what psychologist Alice Miller called the drama of the gifted child. Miller's work, first published in 1979, sent shockwaves through the psychological community because it named something that millions of people had experienced but never had language for. The gifted child she described wasn't necessarily academically gifted, though they often were. The gift she was pointing to was different. The gift of emotional sensitivity, of perception, of the ability to attune to others' needs with almost preternatural accuracy. This gift, in a healthy environment, would have been celebrated. It would have allowed the child to become deeply empathic, deeply connected, deeply alive to the emotional textures of human experience. But in an environment where the child's own emotional needs weren't being met, this same gift became a survival tool. The sensitive child used their perception to figure out what the adults needed, and then twisted themselves to provide it. Miller, a Swiss psychoanalyst who wrote extensively about the lasting effects of childhood emotional dynamics, observed a pattern in her practice that surprised her. Her most successful patients, the high achievers, the impressive professionals, the people who seemed to have it all together, were often the ones struggling most profoundly. These weren't people who had been overtly abused or neglected in ways that were easy to name. Many came from families that looked perfectly fine from the outside. Their parents loved them, provided for them, wanted the best for them. But there was a subtle transaction happening beneath the surface. The parents, often due to their own unmet emotional needs, required something from the child. Maybe they needed the child to be successful to validate their own worth. Maybe they needed the child to be happy so they wouldn't have to feel guilty. Maybe they needed the child to be calm and easy because they couldn't handle any more stress. And the gifted child, that sensitive, perceptive creature, figured this out. They became what Miller described as so attuned to their parents' expectations that they do whatever it takes to fulfill these expectations while ignoring their own feelings and needs. The child learns, my feelings are not as important as your feelings. My needs are not as important as your needs. My job is to make you okay so that I can be okay. This isn't conscious. A 6-year-old isn't calculating strategy. They're surviving. They're doing what children do when the emotional environment requires it, adapting to stay connected to the people they depend on completely. But the adaptation comes at a price. The price is the true self, which gets locked away in what Miller described as a kind of glass cellar, still there, still present, but unreachable. The child grows up without access to their own genuine feelings, desires, and identity. They become experts at being what others need, while having very little sense of who they actually are. And so the good child is born. Let's be specific about what this looks like, because it's important to understand that we're not talking about ordinary childhood responsibility or maturity. We're talking about a particular constellation of patterns that emerge when a child takes on roles they're not developmentally equipped to handle. The signs are often subtle, easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. The child who always knew when mom was having a bad day before anyone said anything. The child who smoothed things over when dad came home in a bad mood. The child who took care of younger siblings, not occasionally but constantly, stepping into a parental role while still being a child themselves. It's the child who was praised for being so mature, such an old soul, wise beyond their years. These compliments, often well-intentioned, are actually markers of a child who has had to grow up too fast. A truly safe childhood allows for immaturity, for silliness, for the gradual development of adult capacities rather than their premature deployment. It's the child who never had a rebellious phase, who was always agreeable, who made their parents' lives easier at every turn. Parents often talk about how lucky they were to have such an easy kid. But an easy kid is sometimes a kid who learned early that being difficult wasn't safe. A kid who suppressed their natural developmental need to push back, to individuate, to cause problems, because the family system couldn't tolerate it. It's the child who is the family's therapist, confidant, or mediator. The one mom talked to about her problems with dad. The one who knew about adult stresses, about financial worries, about marital conflicts, long before they were developmentally ready to carry that information. This child was often told, "I don't know what I'd do without you," and felt a mix of pride and terror at those words. Pride at being needed, terror at what might happen if they weren't. Researchers in developmental psychology have identified this phenomenon under various names: parentification, adultification, role reversal. The core dynamic is the same. The child becomes a caregiver to the parent rather than the other way around. This can be emotional parentification, where the child becomes the parent's confidant, therapist, or emotional regulator. The child absorbs the parent's anxieties, mediates between family members, or manages a parent's moods. They become hyper-attuned to emotional atmospheres, developing what amounts to a psychological radar system that's always scanning for danger. It can also be instrumental parentification, where the child takes on practical adult responsibilities, caring for younger siblings, managing household tasks, handling finances, becoming the competent one when the adults cannot or will not. Research on parentification has found remarkably consistent outcomes. Children who take on these roles, particularly the emotional caretaking, are at significantly higher risk for anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties in adulthood. The child who is praised for being mature beyond their years grows into an adult who doesn't know how to have needs, who feels guilty for wanting anything for themselves, who cannot rest because rest was never safe. One study published in the journal Child Development found that emotional parentification in childhood was strongly associated with insecure attachment styles in adulthood, particularly anxious and preoccupied attachment. These are adults who struggle to trust, who fear abandonment, who have difficulty believing they're worthy of love that isn't earned through caretaking. The good child doesn't learn that love is unconditional. They learn that love is a transaction. You give something, the performance of goodness, the suppression of your true self, and you receive something in return. Acceptance, approval, security. When you stop giving, the love might stop too. This belief, formed before the child has the cognitive ability to question it, becomes the foundation upon which they build their entire sense of self and their understanding of how relationships work. There's a particular version of this dynamic that deserves special attention because it's so common and so rarely recognized. The family where love was conditional on achievement. These aren't overtly abusive families. Often, they're families that value education, hard work, and success. The parents might be professionals, immigrants striving for a better life, or simply people who believe that high expectations are good parenting. The message to the child, sometimes spoken and sometimes simply absorbed, is: your value is directly proportional to your performance. You are good when you achieve. You are loved when you succeed. Your worth is not inherent. It must be earned, demonstrated, proved. The child learns this lesson thoroughly. They become the straight A student, the star athlete, the accomplished musician. They develop a work ethic that seems impressive from the outside, but is actually driven by terror. The terror of being worthless. The terror of not being enough. The terror that if they stop producing, if they falter even once, the precarious foundation of their lovability will collapse. This is the origin of what we call perfectionism. And it's important to understand that perfectionism isn't about high standards. It's about survival. The perfectionist child learns that mistakes are catastrophic because mistakes, in their experience, meant withdrawal of approval, disappointed looks, subtle or not so subtle messages that they had failed to be acceptable. They learn that their best is never quite good enough, that there's always something more they could have done, that rest is laziness, and laziness is unforgivable. Research consistently links perfectionism to anxiety, depression, and burnout. Studies have found that perfectionist tendencies create what researchers call a hypervigilant state, where the nervous system is constantly scanning for errors, for potential failures, for anything that might threaten the fragile sense of worthiness that depends entirely on performance. The perfectionist child becomes an adult who cannot celebrate their accomplishments because they are already focused on the next thing, who cannot accept compliments because they don't believe them, who cannot rest because rest feels like dying, because their identity is so thoroughly constructed around doing that simply being feels like ceasing to exist. There's another pattern that's particularly insidious because it often looks like empathy and kindness. The child who becomes the family peacemaker. This is the child who learns early that conflict is dangerous. Maybe one parent had a temper. Maybe divorce was always looming in the background. Maybe the family's stability seemed to hang by a thread that the child felt responsible for holding together. This child develops an almost supernatural ability to sense tension before it erupts. They learn to defuse situations, to soothe upset parents, to step between arguing adults, to sacrifice their own needs to keep everyone calm. They become experts at managing other people's emotions, often at the expense of recognizing their own. The peacemaker child typically develops what psychologists call a fawn response, one of the lesser-known trauma responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Fawning is the instinctive response to threat through people-pleasing, through making yourself useful, through eliminating anything about yourself that might provoke conflict. Adults who grew up as peacemakers often have profound difficulty with boundaries. They've been trained since childhood to prioritize others' needs, to read others' emotions as more valid than their own, to believe that keeping the peace is more important than speaking their truth. They often end up in relationships with people who take advantage of this, not necessarily maliciously, but simply because the peacemaker makes it so easy. They don't ask for things. They don't complain. They don't rock the boat. They absorb difficulties that aren't theirs to carry, and they tell themselves this is just who they are. They're the caretaker, the giver, the one who holds everything together until they can't anymore. What does this collapse look like? It varies, but there are common patterns. Sometimes it's burnout, a complete exhaustion that no vacation can touch, because it's not about being tired from work. It's about being tired from a lifetime of performing, of managing, of never being allowed to simply exist without producing value. The good child's nervous system has been stuck in a chronic state of activation for so long that it no longer knows how to downregulate. Rest doesn't feel restful because the body doesn't believe it's allowed to rest. The research on stress and the nervous system helps explain this. Chronic childhood stress, including the stress of having to manage parents' emotions and suppress one's own needs, actually changes the architecture of the brain and the functioning of the stress response system. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates the body's response to threat, becomes hyperactive. The nervous system gets stuck in what's called a sympathetic dominant state, always ready for danger, never fully at ease. This isn't a character flaw or a lack of willpower. It's a physiological adaptation that happened before the conscious mind was fully developed. The good child's body learned, at a cellular level, that safety required vigilance. Decades later, even when the external threats have passed, the body keeps responding as if danger is imminent. This is why simple advice like just relax or take a vacation doesn't work for the good child. Their inability to relax isn't a choice. It's a deeply ingrained pattern that requires careful, patient work to unwind. It often requires somatic approaches, therapies that work with the body directly, because the pattern isn't stored in thoughts, but in tissue, in breath, in the fundamental rhythms of the nervous system. Sometimes it's depression, a flatness, an emptiness, a sense of going through the motions of a life that looks successful but feels hollow. The good kid who did everything right finds themselves in their 30s or 40s asking, is this it? Is this all there is? They have the career, the relationship, the house, the achievements, and they feel nothing. Or worse, they feel a grief they cannot name. Sometimes it's anxiety, a constant low-level dread that something terrible is about to happen, that the other shoe is about to drop, that they're one mistake away from catastrophe. The hypervigilance that kept them safe in childhood has become a prison they cannot escape, an alarm system that never turns off because they've never learned that they're allowed to be safe. Sometimes it's relational crisis, the marriage that collapses because they could never say what they needed, the pattern of choosing partners who take more than they give, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only know the full self, who have never seen the real person underneath. And sometimes, increasingly, it's a crisis of identity, the terrifying realization that they don't know who they actually are. They've spent so long being what others needed, performing the role of the good child turned good adult, that when you ask them what they want, what they feel, what they need, they have no answer. The true self was locked away so long ago that they no longer know how to find it. Psychologist Jonas Webb coined the term childhood emotional neglect to describe a phenomenon that affects millions of people who grew up in families that looked functional from the outside. Childhood emotional neglect isn't about what happened to you. It's about what didn't happen. What didn't happen was that your emotions weren't consistently seen, validated, and responded to. What didn't happen was that you weren't taught that your inner world mattered. What didn't happen was that you weren't given permission to be fully human, with all the messiness that entails. Webb's research found that adults who experience childhood emotional neglect share certain characteristics: a sense of emptiness or numbness, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions, harsh self-criticism, a deep sense that something is wrong with them, and difficulty asking for help or letting others take care of them. They often describe feeling like they're different from other people, like everyone else got a manual for life that they somehow missed. They feel disconnected from themselves and from others, going through life with a vague sense that something essential is missing, without being able to name what it is. This is the good child grown up. This is the long-term cost of being easy, being mature, being responsible, being good. The cost is your own emotional life, your own authentic self, your own sense of inherent worth that doesn't depend on what you produce or how much you help others. So what does healing look like? How does someone who has spent their entire life in a false self begin to find their way back to something more authentic? The first step is recognition. Understanding that what happened to you was real, even if it was invisible. This is particularly difficult for good children because their experience often doesn't fit the cultural narratives we have about childhood trauma. They weren't beaten, they weren't starved. They might have been loved, genuinely loved, by parents who were doing their best. But something essential was missing. Their emotional needs weren't met. Their true selves weren't welcomed, and the adaptations they made in response, while necessary at the time, are now causing them harm. This recognition often brings grief. Not grief for the obviously terrible things, but grief for what was supposed to be there and wasn't. Grief for the childhood they should have had, where they could have been messy and difficult and fully themselves. Grief for the true self that got locked away, for all the years spent in a prison of goodness that they didn't even know they were building. This grief is essential and can't be skipped. The good child learned to bypass difficult emotions, to keep moving, to stay productive, learning to actually feel, to let sadness and anger and longing wash through without immediately trying to fix or manage them, is itself a radical act. The work that follows involves learning things that most people learn in childhood, that you're allowed to have needs, that those needs don't make you selfish or too much, that you can take up space in the world, that you're worthy of love simply because you exist and not because of what you provide. Internal family systems therapy, developed by psychologist Richard Schwartz, offers a useful framework for this work. IFS suggests that we all have parts, different aspects of our psyche that developed to protect us and help us cope. The good child has highly developed protective parts: the perfectionist, the people pleaser, the caretaker, and exile parts that hold the vulnerable feelings and needs that were never safe to express. Healing in this framework involves getting to know these parts, understanding their original purpose, and helping them update their roles. The inner critic that berates you for every mistake, originally developed to protect you from external criticism. The people-pleasing part that can't say no, developed to keep you safe in relationships where your needs weren't welcome. These parts aren't enemies to be conquered. They're protectors to be understood and compassionately relieved of duties they no longer need to perform. This is challenging work because those protective parts don't trust easily. They've been running the show for decades, and they have good reason to believe their vigilance is essential. The perfectionist is terrified of what will happen if standards slip. The people pleaser is convinced that setting boundaries will lead to abandonment. The inner critic believes that without its harsh voice, you'll become lazy, worthless, unlovable. Healing requires creating enough safety, enough internal and external support, that these parts can begin to relax their grip. It requires new experiences that prove the old rules no longer apply, that you can be imperfect and still be loved, that you can have needs and still be connected, that you can be yourself and the world won't end. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and elaborated by Mary Ainsworth, offers another lens for understanding both the wound and the healing. The good child typically develops what's called an insecure attachment style, either anxious, constantly seeking reassurance and fearing abandonment, or avoidant, protecting themselves by not needing anyone too much. Research has shown that attachment styles, while formed in childhood, are not destiny. Through what's called earned secure attachment, adults can develop new patterns of relating. This usually happens through a combination of insight, therapeutic work, and corrective experiences in adult relationships. The key is finding relationships, whether with a therapist, a partner, a friend, or a community, where you can risk being seen in ways you never were before, where you can express needs and have them met instead of dismissed, where you can be imperfect and still be valued, where you can slowly, tentatively begin to let the true self emerge from its glass cellar. This is terrifying. The good child learned early that showing their true self was dangerous, that vulnerability led to rejection, that authenticity wasn't welcome. Every instinct will scream that it's safer to keep performing, to keep managing, to keep being good. But the cost of staying safe in that way is the cost of never really living, of going through your entire existence as a character in a play written by someone else, performing a role that was assigned to you before you were old enough to consent. Let's talk about what recovery actually looks like in practice, because abstract concepts are only useful if they translate into lived experience. Recovery means learning to recognize your emotions as they happen, which is harder than it sounds when you've spent a lifetime automatically suppressing them. It means noticing the tightness in your chest, the knot in your stomach, the subtle cues your body sends that something is affecting you. For many good children, emotions were so unsafe that they learned to disconnect from their bodies entirely. Reconnecting is slow, patient work. Recovery means practicing having needs and expressing them, which will feel selfish and dangerous at first. Telling someone you'd rather go to a different restaurant, saying no to a request that you don't have capacity for, asking for help with something you could technically do yourself. Each of these tiny acts is a revolution against the conditioning that said your needs don't matter. Recovery means learning to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. The good child developed highly efficient coping mechanisms: overworking, caretaking, staying busy, managing everyone else's problems. Learning to simply feel without doing anything about it, without solving or fixing or producing, is profoundly uncomfortable. It's also essential. Recovery means grieving, probably multiple times, as different layers of loss reveal themselves. Grieving the childhood you didn't have. Grieving the self you might have been. Grieving the relationships that couldn't hold your authentic self. Grieving the years spent in a prison you didn't know you were in. Recovery means learning to parent yourself in the ways you weren't parented, with unconditional positive regard, with attunement to your emotional needs, with the consistent message that you're worthy of love, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. There's something else that needs to be said here, something that complicates the narrative, but is essential to a complete picture. Many good children have complicated feelings about their parents. They might love their parents deeply. They might recognize that their parents were doing their best with their own limited resources, their own unhealed wounds, their own struggles. They might be reluctant to frame their experience as harmful because it feels like a betrayal, an accusation, an act of ingratitude. This is where nuance is essential. It is possible to hold multiple truths at once: that your parents loved you, that they wanted the best for you, that they might have been dealing with their own trauma and limitations, and also that what happened left wounds, that you needed something you didn't get, that the adaptations you made to survive have cost you something precious. Understanding is not the same as condemning. Recognizing how your childhood shaped you doesn't require you to write off your parents as monsters. Most parents who raised good children weren't malicious. They were often good children themselves, passing on the only patterns they knew, caught in an intergenerational cycle that no one chose and everyone inherited. Breaking that cycle, which is possible, doesn't require blame. It requires awareness. It requires the willingness to see clearly, to grieve honestly, and to choose differently. For those who have children of their own, this work becomes even more urgent. Research on parentification and childhood emotional neglect consistently shows intergenerational transmission. Patterns tend to repeat unless consciously interrupted. The good child who becomes a parent faces a particular challenge. How do you give your children something you never received? How do you attune to their emotions when you've been trained to ignore your own? How do you create a home where it's safe to be difficult, to have needs, to be fully human when you never had that yourself? This is possible, but it requires intentional work, It requires healing your own wounds so you don't unconsciously use your children to meet your unmet needs. It requires learning to tolerate your children's difficult emotions without needing to fix them immediately, which means learning to tolerate your own difficult emotions first. It requires offering your children what Winnicott called good enough parenting. Not perfect, but attuned, present, responsive, communicating through 1,000 small interactions that their inner world matters, that their feelings are valid, that they're loved not for being good, but simply for being. This is perhaps the most profound healing available, to break the cycle by giving your children what you didn't receive, and in doing so, to offer yourself that same compassion. There's one more area I want to explore before we move toward conclusion: the workplace. Because the good child's patterns don't just show up in intimate relationships, they permeate every aspect of adult life, and the professional realm is no exception. The good child often excels professionally, at least by external metrics. They're reliable, they're conscientious, they go above and beyond. They're the employee who never complains, who picks up slack for others, who stays late without being asked. Managers love them. They get promoted. They build impressive resumes. But underneath this success, something darker is happening. The good child at work doesn't know how to set boundaries around their time and energy. They say yes to everything because saying no feels like failure. They take on more than they can handle because they don't believe they're allowed to have limits. They respond to emails at midnight, work through lunch, sacrifice vacations, all while telling themselves this is just what it takes to succeed. What it actually takes, though, is their health, their relationships, their sense of self outside of work. The good child turned professional often ties their identity so thoroughly to their job performance that any criticism feels like an existential threat. They interpret feedback not as information about their work, but as information about their worth. A negative review isn't something to learn from. It's proof that they are, as they always secretly feared, not good enough. This makes them simultaneously the most hard-working employees and the most fragile. They're high achievers who are one bad day away from falling apart. They succeed and succeed and succeed, but the success brings no satisfaction because there's always more to do. Always another way they might fail. Always another performance required to maintain the illusion of acceptability. Burnout in this population is nearly inevitable. The body eventually rebels against decades of overwork, driven not by passion, but by fear. The collapse might look like physical illness, mental health crisis, or simply a profound disillusionment with a career that was never really chosen, but rather assigned by the need to prove worth. The healing journey for the good child at work involves learning to do something that feels almost impossible, to work at a sustainable pace, to say no sometimes, to disappoint people occasionally, to be a good employee without being a perfect one, and to discover that the world doesn't end when you stop being exceptional all the time. This is terrifying because the good child genuinely believes that their value is what they produce, learning that they have inherent worth, that they matter simply because they exist and not because of what they accomplish, is perhaps the most fundamental shift the healing process requires. If you recognize yourself in what I've described, I want to leave you with a few things. First, what you're experiencing is real. The emptiness, the exhaustion, the sense that something is fundamentally wrong despite doing everything right. These aren't character flaws or moral failures. They're the long-term consequences of adaptations you made to survive a childhood that required you to be something other than yourself. This experience has a name. It has been studied. You are not alone in it. Millions of people are walking around with the same invisible wound, the same glass cellar in their psyche, the same exhaustion from a lifetime of performance. You are part of a silent community of people who are shaped by similar forces, and recognizing this can itself be a first step toward healing. Second, it's not your fault. You didn't choose to become the good child. You responded to an environment that demanded it. A child does not have the power to refuse adaptation. A child cannot say, "I will not conform to my family's emotional needs." The survival instinct is too strong, the dependency too absolute. You did what you had to do to stay connected to the people you needed to survive. The strategies that now cause you pain once kept you safe. They deserve acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude, before they can be released. There's a reason they developed. That reason was real. Honoring that doesn't mean you have to keep living by those strategies forever. Third, healing is possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. The patterns that have governed your life for decades can change. The true self that was locked away is still there, waiting. The neural pathways that were formed in childhood can be rewired. The nervous system that learned to be constantly vigilant can learn slowly to rest. You are not condemned to spend the rest of your life as the good child. You are not trapped in the performance forever. Change is possible. It happens every day for people who were exactly where you are now. Fourth, you don't have to do this alone. In fact, you probably can't. The wound happened in relationship, and it heals in relationship too. Finding people who can see you, really see you, and hold space for all of who you are is not optional. It's essential. This might mean therapy with someone who understands developmental trauma and attachment. It might mean support groups or communities where you can share your experience with others who understand. It might mean slowly, carefully, building more authentic connections in your existing relationships. Whatever form it takes, you need witnesses. You need people who can reflect back to you that you are more than your performance, that you matter beyond what you produce, that you are worthy of love you don't have to earn. And finally, perhaps most importantly, you are allowed to stop being good, not to become bad, not to harm others or abandon responsibility, but to stop performing, to stop managing everyone else's emotions, to stop earning your right to exist through productivity and helpfulness and flawless behavior. You are allowed to be difficult sometimes, to have needs, to take up space, to say no, to make mistakes, to rest without justification, to want things for yourself, to be a whole, complicated, sometimes messy human being. You've spent your entire life being good enough for everyone else. It's time to learn that you are always good enough for yourself. Let me take a moment to go deeper into something I touched on earlier, because I think it's important to really understand the internal landscape of the good child turned adult. There's a particular quality to their suffering that often goes unrecognized because it doesn't fit our usual categories. The good child often experiences what might be called high-functioning distress. From the outside, everything looks fine. They're succeeding at work, they're maintaining relationships, they're handling their responsibilities. No one would look at them and think, that person is struggling. But inside, there's a constant hum of anxiety that never fully quiets, a sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. A vigilance so chronic that they don't even notice it anymore. The way a fish doesn't notice water. They've been swimming in cortisol since childhood. Their nervous system's wired for threat detection, and they've come to believe this is just how life feels. They often describe themselves as tired for no reason. They might have trouble sleeping despite being exhausted. They might have unexplained physical symptoms, headaches, digestive issues, tension in their jaw or shoulders that doctors can't fully explain. The body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk famously wrote, and the body of the good child has been keeping score for decades. There's also a particular kind of loneliness that the good child experiences, which is perhaps the most painful aspect of all. They're often surrounded by people. They might have partners, friends, colleagues who care about them. But there's a glass wall between them and everyone else. They can see through it, they can interact through it, but they can't really touch. This is because what people know of them is the false self, the performance of goodness, the mask they've worn so long they barely remember putting it on. Even in their closest relationships, some essential part of them remains hidden, not deliberately, but automatically, because revealing that hidden self never felt safe. The result is a profound loneliness that exists alongside connection. They're alone in a crowd, loved perhaps, but not fully known. And there's a grief in that, a grief for the intimacy that remains just out of reach, for the experience of being truly seen that they've never really had. I want to talk about something that's often uncomfortable to address: anger. The good child learned early that anger was not acceptable. In families where being easy and responsible was the currency of love, anger was dangerous. Anger meant conflict. Anger meant disruption. Anger meant potentially losing the connection to the people you depended on. So the good child suppressed their anger, often so thoroughly that they lost touch with it entirely. They might not even recognize themselves as angry people. They're the calm ones, the reasonable ones, the ones who never yell. But anger doesn't disappear just because it's not expressed. It goes underground. It turns inward. It becomes depression, which many researchers have described as anger without the enthusiasm. It becomes chronic physical symptoms. It becomes a pervasive sense of flatness, of not caring, of emotional numbness, or it leaks out in unexpected ways. Irritability that seems disproportionate to the situation, resentment that builds up over years until it finally explodes, passive-aggressive behavior that lets the anger out sideways when direct expression still feels impossible. The truth is, the good child had plenty to be angry about. They were asked to carry burdens that weren't theirs. They were required to suppress essential parts of themselves. They were loved conditionally, even if no one ever said those words out loud. They lost their childhood to responsibilities and emotional caretaking that should never have been their job. That anger is legitimate, it's appropriate, and part of healing involves finally allowing it to exist, to be felt, to be expressed in healthy ways. This is terrifying for someone who has spent their entire life believing that anger would destroy everything, Learning that it's possible to be angry and still be loved, to express displeasure and still be connected, is one of the most radical and healing discoveries the good child can make. I also want to address the inner critic, because almost every good child grows up to have a ferocious one. The inner critic is that voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that points out every flaw, every mistake, every way you've fallen short, that holds you to impossible standards and then condemns you for failing to meet them. Most people have some version of an inner critic, but the good child's critic is often especially savage. It knows exactly where the vulnerabilities are. It speaks in the voice of disappointment, of conditional approval, of the constant message that they're almost good enough, but not quite. The critic might say things like, "You should have done better. What's wrong with you? Everyone else can handle this. Why can't you? If people really knew you, they wouldn't like you. You're lazy. You're selfish for wanting anything for yourself. You don't deserve to rest until everything is perfect." These messages often echo things that were said, directly or indirectly, in childhood, or they represent the child's internalization of the conditional love they received. Either way, they've been playing on loop for so long that they feel like objective truth rather than the wounded voice of a scared part. For the good child, the inner critic is particularly brutal, and for a particular reason. It's an internalization of all the conditional approval they experienced. The critic is trying to keep them safe by ensuring they never fall below the standards that earn them love. It's a protective mechanism, twisted into something that causes constant pain. From the framework of internal family systems therapy, the inner critic is what's called a protector part. It believes, based on childhood experience, that if it can just make you perfect enough, you'll finally be safe. You'll finally be loved unconditionally. You'll finally be okay. The tragic irony is that the inner critic's strategy never works. No amount of self-criticism produces the safety it's seeking, because the problem was never your imperfection. The problem was an environment that didn't have room for your authentic, imperfect self. No amount of becoming better can solve that original wound. Working with the inner critic involves developing a relationship with it, understanding its origins and intentions, and gently helping it see that its methods aren't achieving its goals. The critic doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be thanked for its efforts, acknowledged for its fear, and helped to find a new role that doesn't involve constant self-attack. This sounds strange if you've spent your life trying to silence your inner critic. But the counterintuitive truth is that fighting the critic usually makes it stronger. What actually works is curiosity, compassion, and the patience to understand why this part of you developed and what it's still trying to protect you from. Let's talk about relationships, because this is where the patterns of the good child often become most painfully visible. The good child turned adult often has a relationship history that follows certain predictable patterns. They might repeatedly choose partners who need caretaking, who have their own wounds and struggles, who require the good child to step into their familiar role of fixer and supporter. There's an unconscious comfort in this. They know how to do it. It feels like love to them because it's the only kind of love they've ever known. Or they might choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, unconsciously recreating the dynamic of trying to earn love from someone who can't fully give it. They work harder, give more, twist themselves into smaller and smaller shapes, all in pursuit of the unconditional acceptance that continues to elude them. Attachment theory helps explain this. The good child typically develops either an anxious attachment style, characterized by constant worry about the relationship, seeking reassurance, and fear of abandonment, or an avoidant attachment style, characterized by maintaining emotional distance, difficulty depending on others, and discomfort with intimacy. Sometimes they develop what's called disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment, a painful combination where they desperately want closeness, but are also terrified of it. They push and pull, moving toward connection and then retreating when it feels too dangerous. Their partners are often confused, and the good child themselves can't fully explain their own behavior. In romantic relationships, the good child often has profound difficulty expressing their needs. They've spent a lifetime prioritizing others, and the idea of saying, "I want this" or "I need this" feels selfish, dangerous, impossible. They might not even know what they want. So disconnected have they become from their own desires. This creates relationships that are fundamentally one-sided. The good child gives and gives, waiting for their partner to somehow intuit their needs without being told. When this doesn't happen, because it can't happen, no one is a mind reader. Resentment builds. The good child feels taken for granted while being unable to articulate what they actually want. Healing in relationships means learning to ask for things, to voice preferences, to say no when something doesn't work, to take up space in the relationship instead of constantly making room for the other person. This is deeply uncomfortable work because it violates every lesson the good child learned about how to stay safe and loved. There's also the question of friendships, which the good child often struggles with in ways they may not recognize. The good child often plays a specific role in their friendships, the listener, the advice giver, the one who always shows up when others need support. Their friends appreciate them, value them, rely on them. The good child is proud of being such a good friend. But there's a cost hidden in this dynamic. The good child rarely calls those same friends when they're struggling. They don't want to be a burden. They don't believe their problems are serious enough to warrant support. They've never learned that they're allowed to be the one who needs something. So their friendships, while often numerous and seemingly close, lack true reciprocity. The good child knows everything about their friends' struggles, but shares little of their own. Their friends might not even know how much they're struggling because the good child has become so skilled at performing okayness. This is lonely, even surrounded by people who care about them. The good child is alone with their pain, and sometimes they're surprised to find that their friendships can't hold them when they finally do reach out, because the dynamic has been set up for so long with the good child as the giver. Both parties may be uncomfortable when the roles try to shift. Learning to have reciprocal friendships, to receive as well as give, to be vulnerable and messy and needy sometimes, this is part of the healing journey. It requires deliberately doing things that feel wrong, sharing struggles instead of hiding them, asking for help instead of offering it, allowing themselves to be cared for instead of always being the caretaker. There's a particular trap that the good child often falls into when they begin to recognize these patterns. The trap of self-improvement. They read the books, they go to therapy, they do the personal development work, and all of this is good. All of this can be helpful, but there's a danger lurking inside it. The danger is that the good child approaches healing the same way they approached everything else in their life, as a performance to be perfected. They try to heal correctly. They beat themselves up for not healing fast enough. They add becoming psychologically healthy to the list of achievements they need to accomplish to finally be acceptable. This is the perfectionist wound co-opting the healing process. Instead of actually healing, they become perfect at appearing healed. Instead of genuinely changing, they become skilled at the language of therapy, the concepts of self-help, the performance of personal growth, while the actual wounds remain untouched underneath. Real healing isn't a project to be completed. It's not a goal to be achieved. It doesn't have a finish line where you finally arrive at being fixed. Real healing is messy, non-linear, full of setbacks and struggles. It takes much longer than you want it to, and it doesn't follow the timeline you've set for it. The good child needs to learn to be bad at healing, to heal imperfectly, to take years longer than they think they should, to backslide and struggle and not have it all figured out. This itself is part of the healing. Learning that they're allowed to do things imperfectly, including the process of recovery. I want to speak directly to something now, because I think it matters. If you've recognized yourself in this, you might be feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that there's a name for what you've experienced. Grief for what you lost. Maybe some anger, either at your parents or at yourself for not seeing this sooner. Maybe resistance, a part of you that doesn't want any of this to be true, that wants to keep believing everything is fine. All of these responses are normal. They're valid. There's no right way to feel as you recognize the water you've been swimming in all your life. But I want to say something specific to the part of you that might be minimizing this, that's thinking, my childhood wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. I shouldn't be making such a big deal out of this. That voice, that minimizing voice, is itself a product of what happened to you. The good child learned to make themselves small, to not take up too much space, to not have needs that were too big. That training doesn't just disappear when you start to recognize it. It will actively fight against your attempts to acknowledge your own pain. The truth is that emotional neglect and conditional love cause real harm. The harm is different from the harm of overt abuse, but it's not less real. You don't have to have been beaten or starved to have been wounded. The wound of not being seen, not being known, not being loved for who you actually were, that's a real wound. Your pain is valid, even if it's invisible, even if others had it worse. Comparison is not a useful framework here. Someone else's deeper suffering doesn't make yours disappear. You're allowed to grieve what you lost. You're allowed to be affected by what happened. You're allowed to heal from wounds that no one can see. Let me paint a picture of what the other side might look like, because healing isn't just about understanding the wound. It's about glimpsing what's possible beyond it. Imagine waking up in the morning without dread, without the immediate mental inventory of everything you have to do, everyone you have to take care of, all the ways you might fail today. Imagine starting your day with something closer to peace, Imagine being able to say no to a request that doesn't work for you and feeling okay about it. Not good, necessarily, at least not at first, but okay. Not terrified, not consumed with guilt. Just okay, with the normal discomfort of doing something new, but without the catastrophic fear. Imagine being in a relationship where you actually say what you want, where you ask for things without the elaborate justifications, the apologies, the disclaimers that it's not really that important. Imagine having a partner who knows you, really knows you, because you've let them see the parts of yourself you've always hidden. Imagine feeling your feelings, all of them, without immediately trying to fix them or push them away or use them as fuel for productivity. Imagine being sad when you're sad, angry when you're angry, joyful when you're joyful, without the constant management, the constant performance. Imagine resting without guilt, doing nothing and not feeling like you're dying, taking time for yourself without needing to justify it by how it will make you more productive later. Imagine knowing who you are, not the role you play, not the mask you wear, not the performance of goodness you've spent your life perfecting, but the actual you, with all your contradictions and complexities and desires that don't make sense and feelings that aren't convenient. This is what's on the other side of the healing. Not a perfect life, not an absence of struggle, but something far more valuable. A life that's actually yours. A self you can finally inhabit. The experience, perhaps for the first time, of being home in your own skin. It's a long road to get there. There's no shortcut, but the road exists, and others have walked it, and you can too. Before I close, I want to address something that I think is important. The question of parents. Many good children, when they begin to recognize these patterns, struggle with complicated feelings about their families. They might feel guilty for naming what happened as harmful. They might feel like bad children, ungrateful children, for acknowledging that something was missing in what they received. This guilt is another manifestation of the wounded self. The good child learned that their job was to protect their parents' feelings, and even in adulthood, even in the process of healing, that training persists. They feel worse about the harm caused to their relationship with their parents than about the harm caused to themselves. But here's what I want you to understand. Recognizing how your childhood affected you is not an act of betrayal. It's an act of truth. And truth is the foundation upon which any genuine relationship must be built. You can acknowledge that your parents did their best with what they had. You can understand that they were shaped by their own childhoods, their own wounds, their own limitations. You can hold compassion for them as complex human beings who were struggling too, and you can simultaneously acknowledge that what they provided wasn't enough, that something essential was missing, that you were hurt, not by their malice, but by their limitations, and that hurt is real and needs to be healed. These two truths can coexist. They must coexist if you're going to move forward with any integrity. Some good children find that as they heal, their relationships with their parents actually improve. From a place of greater self-awareness and stronger boundaries, they can relate to their parents more authentically, not as the good child performing goodness, but as an adult meeting other adults with all the complexity that entails. Others find that their relationships with their parents cannot hold the truth of who they are becoming. This is painful, but it is sometimes necessary. You cannot sacrifice your own healing to preserve a relationship that requires you to stay wounded. There's no one right answer here. Every family is different. Every history is unique, and you will have to find your own way through this particular terrain. What I can tell you is that you're allowed to prioritize your own healing. You're allowed to set boundaries. You're allowed to be honest about what you experienced, even if that honesty is uncomfortable for others. The child who learned to disappear is still in there, waiting to come home. The door to the glass cellar can be unlocked. The true self, dormant for so long, is ready to wake up. What you needed as a child, you didn't get. And nothing can change that. No amount of healing can go back in time and give you the childhood you deserved. That grief is real, and it might always be with you to some degree, a tender place that aches sometimes when you least expect it. But what you can get now, as an adult, is different, and in some ways more powerful. You can give yourself what you didn't receive. You can learn to see yourself, know yourself, love yourself the way you needed to be seen and known and loved. You can create relationships where you're valued for who you are, not what you provide. You can slowly, gradually, one difficult day at a time, come home to yourself. The process won't be linear. There will be days when you fall back into old patterns, when the good child rises up and takes over before you even notice what's happening. There will be times when being authentic feels so uncomfortable that you retreat to the familiar comfort of performance. This is normal. This is part of the journey. It doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. Healing happens in layers. You might think you've dealt with something, only to discover a deeper level years later. You might make progress in one area while realizing another area still needs work. You might heal your relationship patterns while your perfectionism remains stubbornly intact, or vice versa. This is the nature of the work. It's not a straight line from wounded to healed. It's a spiral, returning again and again to similar themes, each time with a bit more understanding, a bit more compassion, a bit more freedom. Some days, the freedom will feel exhilarating. You'll say no to something and feel the rush of taking up space in your own life. You'll express a need and have it met. You'll rest without guilt and feel your nervous system finally begin to unwind. Other days, the freedom will feel terrifying. You'll wonder if you're becoming selfish, difficult, unlovable. You'll miss the certainty of the old patterns, the clarity of knowing exactly what was expected of you. You'll want to go back to being good, because at least you knew how to do that. Both responses are part of the process. Hold both with compassion. The performance of being good was never sustainable. It was always going to break down eventually, because it was never meant to be the whole of a life. It was meant to be a temporary adaptation, a way of surviving conditions that have long since changed. You survived. That's the first thing to recognize. Whatever you had to become to get through your childhood, it worked. You're here. You made it. And now, because you survived, you get to do something even harder and more beautiful than surviving. You get to live. You get to find out who you actually are. Underneath the mask, beyond the performance, you get to discover what you really want, not what you should want, not what would make others happy, but what lights you up from the inside. You get to stop being the good child and start being simply, gloriously, imperfectly yourself. You have been carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. You have been performing a role that was assigned without your consent. You have been living a life shaped by survival, by the desperate need to stay connected to people who couldn't fully see you. But you are more than the good child. You are more than the mask. You are more than your usefulness to others. Underneath all of that, beneath the layers of adaptation and the years of performance, there is someone who has been waiting to be discovered. There is a self that wants to know what it actually feels, what it actually wants, what it actually believes, separate from what anyone else needs it to be. That self is worth finding, that life is worth living. And it begins now with recognition, with the understanding that what happened shaped you, but doesn't have to define you. With the first tentative steps toward a freedom you may not even be able to fully imagine yet. The good child learned early that the world required their smallness. But the world is bigger than your childhood taught you. There is room for you to take up space. There is room for you to have needs. There is room for you to be difficult, complicated, imperfect, and human. Step into that room. It belongs to you. It always did. You just had to find your way home to claim it.